last week on the show, Simon did a very lengthy rant talking about film critics not being shown any due respect, and I was like, yeah, whatever, Simon.
That's
Okay,
me.
that's all very perfectly fine and well. I guess you've got your concerns, but anyway, in the spirit of throwing Simon a bone, I thought, yeah, let's celebrate critics. So look. We've all got our favorite critics. The best known is probably, in terms of like film criticism, like the best known critics to mainstream people is probably Siskel and Ebert. They hosted a syndicated
Sure.
film show in the US called At the Movies for about 14 years. Australia, we had our own At the Movies, just ripped off the whole thing. We got the reviewing duo of the seemingly thumbless David Stratton and Margaret Pomeranz. And of course, the less said about their coming attractions critic Jay Sherman, the better. But the question is, who do Simon and I rate? They don't have to be critics who've been on TV, like just critics across the board. They could be TV critics, they
Sure.
could be movie critics, maybe we'll talk about food critics. Who knows where this conversation's going, but who are the critics worth paying attention to? So, Simon, I thought this week we can both come to this, just name a couple of our favorite critics, why we like them, and maybe we just engender a bit of a conversation about what it is about these critics we like and why we think that's important as a voice of like within criticism.
I think that's a great idea. I think critics should be given their due. Some of them, the very good ones,
No, Simon, let's not
write
overrate
some.
things too much. They don't need that much due.
They do need their due. The very best critics offer incredible insight into the art form, whether it's film or television or restaurants or whatever. So, all right, I'm going to kick things off. And this is going to be the first one is a takes me right back to when I absolutely first started falling in love with the movies, which was the late 70s. I'd have been maybe 10, 11 years old, something like that. And the only source of film writing I had at that stage was the daily newspapers, The Sun, The Telegraph, the Herald, of course. And there was a wave here in Sydney, at least, and there was a whole generation of Australian critics, people like Bev Tivy, who the late great Bev Tivy, who was fortunate enough to have met on a couple of occasions before she passed. The wonderful Tina Kaufman wrote back in those days. My favourite at the time was a gentleman named John Hanrahan. Now, some will remember John from his Channel 7 sort of interstitial reviews and interview shows. He had a huge history across the entertainment industry. He was the Hollywood Reporter's Australian editor, the president of the Film Critics Association, Critics Circle Association from 97 to 2000. Wrote for The Sun, covered television and radio and music and theatre productions all over Australia, covered a whole bunch of Cannes film festivals. He wrote the first biography on actor Mel Gibson as well back in the day. He has put all his television reviews and interviews up on his new YouTube channel, just called John Hanrahan's Movie Star Interviews. And to see and hear these actors and the way he talks to them back in the day, he's that sort of. I have a little bit of an issue with entertainment reporter slash film critic because that can blur, and very often you're asked to review the films you're also getting an interview for, and that can impinge the integrity of your review and those sort of things. Hanrahan wasn't afraid to speak openly about what he thought about films, both as a critic and as an interviewer, and that was really, really interesting to me. So I'm going to go right back to John Hanrahan, who's still with us and still doing great work and a very successful businessman as well. But he was in that first wave of reviewers that I found really informative and have a huge amount of respect for.
Yeah, look, I don't think that one can really get away from the idea that a role as a critic blends into other elements of work around sort of screen culture. So often, if you're a critic, you're doing interviews with talent, you may be
Oh,
doing
sure.
some commentary and analysis about the industry. Like, there's all sorts of various areas depending on what sort of critic you are and where you're sort of coming from that sort of lends into various things. So I just don't think that could be escaped. There's no purity when it comes to film criticism or TV criticism, and probably not restaurant
Mm.
criticism as well, I would presume. But yeah, I don't know. I never really sort of think about that too much because I just think the reality is you just can't, film criticism should be a purity contest. Uh, Let me sort of kick off with someone that I probably think is my favorite critic of the moment. And I think when it comes to film criticism, there's I'm probably looking for something slightly different than what I think you're after, Simon, when we're going through it. And this is just um, I guess, personal style a little bit, but also, I guess, maybe just sort of where I see the need and function of a critic existing, where I think maybe I'm a little bit more earthy in what I'm looking for from a critic. I'm not necessarily after an analysis of, oh, this performance was amazing, because as far as I'm concerned, a critic's actually not the best person who's equipped to be able to say that an acting performance was amazing, because they're not an actor. Okay, they've probably, I mean, speaking broadly, I'm sure there's some critics that have been actors and have gone through acting school, but broadly, a critic is being asked to evaluate a whole bunch of things which they're not actually credited to be able to adequately offer analysis on. But they can offer some insights and thoughts about how something made them feel, how they reacted to something, and whether from their perspective they saw something as a strong performance or not. But you always have to go into that with just a little bit of an understanding of, yes, it's a great performance from a schmo who doesn't necessarily know better, but if you understand technique a little bit more, you may actually find it's not that strong a performance. So there are some caveats involved in what they're doing. I prefer a critic to be not necessarily offering their verdict on something as much as those that start a conversation about what's taking place within the confines of a TV series or a film. So, with that in mind, the critic that I probably enjoy the most at the moment is Lucy Mangan, who's a critic for The Guardian. She is very much a Simon Foster style critic, where she comes at things very much from, oh, this is a magnificent performance, whatever. But also, she comes at it a little bit more from a Dan Barrett perspective as well, where she looks at it as conversation starters, throws in elements from her own life, her own perspective, and really sort of just brings that to the fore in every writing she does. What I like about her most is that, one, I think she does bring that sort of very human, realistic perspective to it, but also I just really like her taste. Anytime that I read a review and she says that she likes something, I will always track that down, because I know that if she likes it, I'll probably like it. And to me, that's the form of the critic. You can't look at critics as being like an overall, oh, the critics hated it, so therefore it's bad. What you need to do as a person is find the critics that work for you and the people whose taste and vibe you generally sort of find credit in. And for me, it's Lucy Mangan. She's the one that is kind of just my personal spirit animal. Okay, but she's not going to be for everyone either.
The next critic that I'm going to choose comes from a generation of critics that when I was, I guess, in my early 20s, or maybe sort of starting at 20 going onwards, long form film criticism was still a thing. And magazines like Premiere and Film Comment, and the trades like Variety, specifically for me, but also the Hollywood Reporter, of course, they offered long form film criticism that I just swallowed up, just love to read. People like Todd McCarthy wrote for Variety, and he's one of the most respected sort of trade film reviewer still out there. Stephen Rebello wrote for a great magazine called Movie Line. Glenn Kenny wrote for Premiere as well. Peter de Bruges was a writer who has come to the fore in recent times. He's the chief film critic at Variety magazine. It's a title that he shares with this man, and he's going to be my next on the list. It's called, his name is Owen Gleiberman. He's been with Variety since May 2016, authored a book which I guess I binge read, is the best way to call it, called Movie Freak, My Life Watching Movies, which was sort of his formative years as a music critic, and then a film critic and a social commentator. And it was a pretty amazing book to read, because it very much spoke in the voice I was speaking in. His film reviews for Variety speak to there's a certain personal story that he injects into each review that he's able that gives his reviews a not so much a first person perspective, but a real sort of human way of talking, and a real sort of you may not agree with this, or you may have a different view to this, but this is kind of who I am as a person, and what this film meant to me in that regard. And he has a great knowledge of cinema and cinema history and the industry as well. So Gleiberman, being from that great body of film writers. McCarthy and Rebello and Kenny is the man that I go to read reviews for at the moment.
Yeah. Gliebman, I think he was like former Entertainment Weekly. I think that might be right.
Yeah, he was with Entertainment Weekly for ages, 1990 until 2014, and his book gives a recount of what an ugly sort of separation that was in the end. It had a bit of a Leno Letterman sort of thing going on there behind the scenes, and it was a really terrific read. So, but he's bounced back, and obviously as chief film critic Variety, that's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, sorry, I just got distracted by something. Simon, sorry, Gliebman, just think about him. He's a critic where I really appreciate some of the reviews I read, and then he just really frustrates me from other perspectives. But, like, that's fine. Like, not every critic needs to be agreed with all the time. I think it's important to take a number of perspectives on board and sort of, just think about it. Because it's really just opinion and perspective. Like, there's no ultimate truth being issued by any of these people. Two critics, I just want to lump my other two in just as part of the same conversation. Matt Zola Seitz, who I really quite like, and also Alan Sepinwall. Now, both of them aren't necessarily critics where I tend to agree with a lot that either of them sort of come to, especially Sepinwall. But I kind of like the approach both of them have taken, and they've both very much sort of come up of an age of the internet. So they've both sort of been a little bit maybe sort of scrappier in their approach, and it might just be they're both just generally sort of scrappy people. But I just kind of feel as though they are critics who nothing was necessarily handed to them as much as they've been making a space for themselves and have found themselves in reputable publications and unreputable publications. And while both of them have worked together as well, there's Matt Zola Seitz written this great sort of Mad Men book that I like, but the two of them work together on a Sopranos book, which is exceptional. I really just appreciate like their on the ground sort of sleeves up approach to all of this. But I wanted to talk about Sepinwall for a moment.
Zola Seitz is with Roger Ebert at the moment, isn't he? Isn't he writing for Ebert.com?
Yeah, he's been working for Ebert.com for years. I think just as Ebert passed away, he was asked to become like the managing editor of it or something. So I don't know what his relationship is with these days, but he was definitely fairly important on that site sort of back in the day. He's a pretty well-respected guy just across the board. But I was particularly wanting to talk about Sepinwall in this one, only because I feel as though Sepinwall is both the beneficiary of coming up at an age where TV recaps were a really big thing and providing analysis on the fly. So the first thing you do after an episode of Lost had gone to air is you'd see what Sepinwall had to say about it, because he was just kind of one of the leading voices to read at the time. And so he was very much there for that episodics. But then when TV started moving more towards a binge mode of distribution, he just became a little bit less integral. Okay, and like he suddenly has valuable insights to offer, even if I don't necessarily agree with him. I still like to know what he has to say. But he just kind of doesn't seem to be a vital voice in that space anymore. And Zola Seitz was also doing some sort of recappy type work sort of along the way, and I think he's fallen victim to it a little bit. But he's also carved out a bit more of a space of just being a sort of a deeper thinker about culture broadly, but then also shows with like a little bit more distance than Sepinwall, who is all about that immediate reaction. Okay, and as soon as he can't immediately react to the TV, suddenly he doesn't really quite have that voice. And it doesn't help him that he's now at Rolling Stone where there's a paywall involved. It sort of seems as though unless you're willing to pay for Rolling Stone, there's just such a separation between what Sepinwall was offering his audience, and the relationship between him and the online audience was such a crucial part of the value of him that as soon as he took that away as well, like it's just kind of, it seems like a critic who's just scratching around at the moment trying to find where he belongs nowadays. And I just find that interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that is interesting. All right, well, let's wrap this up. And this is where I was interested in your comments at the top there when you mentioned your first reviewer. And you said that you like to have a reviewer who you can kind of trust with a point of view, who, if you like their thing, if they like a thing, you're going to like a thing, and you're sure you want to see it and stuff like that. So that's interesting, because my last one is a gentleman who is one of the most controversial film critics doing the rounds at the moment, and who often takes very specific points of view that some detractors will call ultra conservative or very right wing
Simon, we
or
don't need
is
to talk
coming.
about me in this. Like, I know I'm one of your favorites, but, whatever.
It's true. That gentleman is a man called Armand White. Now, Armand
Oh,
White
God.
he's an American. Okay, now wait a minute. He's an American film and music critic who writes for the National Review and Out paper, and he was previously the editor of City Arts and the lead film critic for New York Press, which was an alternative weekly. He's a alternative weekly. Wrote for the City Sun. He's just published a book, or just in the last year or so, called "Make Spielberg Great Again," the Steven Spielberg comments. Now, he and I rarely agree on the politics of a film, but he does genuinely write really compelling and interesting reviews from an entirely different perspective to me. And I think it's really, really important to hear this other point of view on a film, to broaden one's mind as to the film. I'm really passionate about not being caught in the bubble of your own opinions, of your own self sort of what you believe in the world, and only sort of reinforcing that with those around you, that by surrounding yourself with people who have the same opinion. Armand White and I do not have the same opinion on most things, but his criticisms and his writings are compelling to read, and certainly put forward a different point of view that helps me understand that different point of view. Not agree with it, not nod my head along to it. More often I'm shaking my head, but they are legitimate points of view from a very good writer and someone who can look at art, specifically in films in general, from an entirely different perspective. He writes things like, no movie is ahead of its time, just ahead of the cultural gatekeepers, which is the sort of thing that can fire people up, and in doing so can create a whole lot of tension. But that tension is good. That's the kind of discussion you need to have when it comes to discussing art, and it shouldn't be poo-pooed even if you don't agree with it. So I like Armand White's writings, and he can be found. It's not hard to find. Google Armand White and you'll get some idea of how strongly he is viewed on the internet. So that's my three.
Yeah, I was just reading a feature about him on a website called Pure Shit Cinema.
All you got to do is read it. See, this is why occasionally when I'm sitting at home and just channel surfing, I'll watch 20 minutes of Fox News, only because I'm not going to live in a bubble where I criticize it and then someone will say, oh, yeah, how much do you watch? And I say, well, I never watch it. Well, you've got to try to have some understanding of what they're saying and what they're doing as a first-hand experience, rather than and yeah, it infuriates me, and I don't get more than half an hour into most Fox News channels. And sometimes I'll heave out a big sigh when I get to the end of an Armand White film review. But, I'm getting a different perspective, and I think that's important.
Yeah, no, look, I actually agree with that entirely. So, I mean, I'll watch the occasional bit of Fox News for that same perspective. And then also I'll mix that in with a little bit of other conservative podcasts and News Nation and all that sort of, just awful TV. But you kind of need to know what other people are saying. You need to hear perspectives outside of your own circle. So, yeah. Certainly agree.
Exactly right.
Simon, I think it's time to move on with the rest of the podcast.